This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 767 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. The Late Round Draft Guide is available for pre-order right now over on lateround.com. The Draft Guide gives you everything you need to crush your fantasy drafts this year. I walk through everything that I think about when I'm approaching drafts, from why regression means everything to why you're probably overrating your scoring structures. There are tips to find breakout players and busts, and then I give a ton of players that I'm targeting and avoiding in drafts this season. And there's a top 200 rankings and tiers list in there as well. You can pre-order now for $19.99, and when the guide launches on June 30th, that price is going to rise to $24.99. So check that out and all my other offerings out right now over on lateround.com. The first question this week is an email. It says, "Hi JJ, love the pod. As always, it gives me a lot to think about." That's great. Listening to your rushing quarterback podcast today, I found myself thinking that you and many other analysts likely incorporate a lot of what makes a rushing quarterback bad for skill position players into your projections, right? Thus, wouldn't moving those players further down the board be double counting? Relatedly, is this more useful for Dynasty, where player value has more of a multi-year lens, and we should be thinking about shifts in value when situations change, e.g. the Colts drafting Richardson? Thanks, David. So I do think that there are some assumptions being made here that we probably shouldn't make. The first one being that all analysts are creating projections. They're not. I know factually that they're not. The sets of rankings that you're getting from different analysts, a lot of those rankings are not based on projections. Now, to be fair, mine aren't fully based on projections either. I said this on the projection show just a couple of weeks ago, but the process of building projections is often more important than the end number that you get, the projected fantasy total. I do projections to help sort out a player's range of outcomes, and to also see if there are any glaring differences between my projections and what the market's doing. They're definitely helpful when creating rankings, but the rankings are not strictly driven by projections, because projections only tell you a median outcome. There are plenty of points in your fantasy draft where you don't care about the median outcome. You want the higher end outcome. So rankings help balance that. Now, projections themselves should capture a lot of the stuff that I said on the show from earlier this week. If you didn't hear that episode, the TLDR is that mobile quarterbacks are generally bad for their teammates. If a player has a mobile quarterback under center, he's going to have a tougher time scoring fantasy points. Now, since you brought up the Colts, let's talk about them. I actually talked about Jonathan Taylor on that projections episode a couple of weeks back, noting that my projection for him didn't look as good as how the market's drafting him. And because my rankings will loosely reflect my projections, I have Jonathan Taylor ranked lower than the market right now. Because as I build rankings, I'm referencing those projections. It's not like I bumped Jonathan Taylor down even more after doing more research on mobile quarterbacks in fantasy football. And it's not as though someone looking at my rankings will need to bump players down. You should know that the studies that I do for this podcast aren't there to just be informative. I want them to be applied. I myself apply them. So if you hear me say something like second-year wide receivers in the middle rounds tend to hit a really high rate, then you should expect to see my rankings reflect that. But other rankings won't necessarily reflect that. Other analysts won't necessarily favor those types of trends the way that I do. Just like other rankings may not care about skill position players playing alongside a mobile quarterback. At the end of the day, the audience of this podcast is not other analysts. And by analysts, I mean people who are out there in public generating rankings and creating content for people. I know plenty of analysts listen to this show, and I'm grateful and humbled by that. But the vast majority of the people listening to this podcast each week are people who work 9 to 5. They have families, they have lives. They see fantasy football as a hobby. They're just trying to find these little edges to make the right decisions during their drafts and during a fantasy season. And that's what a study like the one earlier this week is for. Like, just imagine a world where Jonathan Taylor was the consensus RB1, and then that study drops, showing that running backs with mobile quarterbacks generally have a tougher time scoring fantasy points. Someone listening to that would then probably not draft Jonathan Taylor first overall. Of course, there's an understanding that anything is possible. Taylor could walk into a 20-touchdown season. He's Jonathan Taylor. But looking at history, looking at logic, we know that he's probably not the best pick at RB1. When you know those little things, you can start to craft your own rankings and your draft strategies to be more accurate. So there's no double counting happening. I didn't finish up that study and start bumping players down when I already had them lower in my rankings. But studies like that get people to think twice about a decision. And that means everything in my opinion. If we want to win at this game, we need that deeper thinking. It helps us win in the long run. And regarding the question about dynasty, yes. If you know a mobile quarterback is going to be around for years, and you know a player on that team will be there for the same duration, that's not a good thing for that player. Because we know year after year that mobile quarterbacks limit their teammates' ability to score fantasy points. This next question is from @MTN Garrett. It says, you just talked about how a mobile quarterback supports only one skill group. In regards to Baltimore, that seems to be the tight end position with Mark Andrews. Would you expect them to buck the trend with their wide receiver core? Or temper expectations for what Bateman and Flowers can do? I think what's important is that the conclusion that I made on that episode earlier this week was not that they can only support one skill group. It's that only one skill group will rank in the top 10. They can have multiple skill groups be above average. We just shouldn't expect multiple skill groups to be great. I think a comparison between two teams might be pretty helpful here. Let's use Baltimore as one because you're already talking about them, and let's use Tom Brady's Buccaneers as another. We'll start with Lamar Jackson's MVP season in 2019. That year, the Ravens went nuts offensively. They scored 3.63 touchdowns per game on offense. During Tom Brady's 2 good years in Tampa Bay, so we'll just ignore last year, the Bucs averaged 3.59 and 3.63 touchdowns per game. So it's a pretty good apples to apples comparison here. These offenses were scoring almost identical number of touchdowns per game. That season for Baltimore, though, they were second in tight end points scored. Their running backs were 11th. So they were close to the top 10. And then the wide receivers were dead last. They were 32nd in points scored. So right away, you can sort of see how all this works together. How when one positional group does well, the other one doesn't. There's only so many fantasy points to go around. And you're going to see that happen for any team, no matter if the quarterback is mobile or not. Like I said, only so many points can go around. But it's not as dramatic as it is for teams with mobile quarterbacks, hence the data from earlier this week. So Baltimore has that 2019 where the offense was absurdly good, and they still didn't have multiple top 10 positional groups. In 2020 for the Ravens, tight ends ranked 17th in points scored, running backs were 14th, wide receivers were 31st. In 2021, tight ends ranked first, back on track. Wide receiver was 26th, running back was 19th. And then last year, tight ends were second in points scored, wideouts were 32nd, and running backs were 30th. But you see how a team with a mobile quarterback needs to have a special offensive season for two positional groups to rank pretty high. And even then, you're not getting multiple top 10 seasons from positional groups. Now let's compare that to the Bucs with Tom Brady. Again, their 2020 and 2021 seasons, they saw an identical touchdowns per game rate as the 2019 Ravens. They were very good offenses. The difference is that Tom Brady isn't stealing production from his skill position players. In 2020, the Bucs ranked 16th in running back scoring, 4th in wide receiver scoring, and 6th in tight end scoring. In 2021, they were 7th in running back scoring. They were 2nd in wide receiver scoring, and they were 3rd in tight end scoring. That would never happen on a team with a mobile quarterback. If someone like Rashad Bateman or Zay Flowers or OBJ end up seeing a high target share in that offense, like a really massive one, it's possible for them to individually do well. I think the Ravens this year will likely finish in the top 10 in tight end scoring. We'd probably all agree with that. But I also think that J.K. Dobbins can still outproduce his ADP. But I also do a ton of fantasy drafts where I can get exposure to a lot of these different outcomes. I think what's important is to just know that if you've got someone like Mark Andrews on your team, you shouldn't be drafting a ton of other Ravens. Whereas you can get away with that more on teams with pocket passers. Having Leonard Fournette and Chris Godwin and Mike Evans in 2020 and 2021 was absolutely fine. Having Mark Andrews and J.K. Dobbins and Zay Flowers this year, even with more pass attempts in that Baltimore offense, I would not advise you do that. So it's a give and take type of thing. We know it's harder for players with mobile quarterbacks to crush it in fantasy football. That's a fact. So you should draft accordingly. And yes, that means that it's going to be harder for Ravens wide receivers to give you week in, week out production. They need to make up for having a mobile quarterback by seeing a higher target share versus their counterparts across the league. A 25% target share in a mobile quarterback's offense is not the same as a 25% target share in a pocket passer's offense, as a general rule of thumb. So in turn, the more crowded it is in a mobile quarterback's offense, the tougher it's going to be for an individual to perform. The next question is from @theprof722. It says, I'm finding Najee Harris to be one of the more difficult running backs to rank. Here's the bull case. If he returns to anything close to his rookie year volume in receptions and becomes more efficient running behind an improved offensive line, he's a top 5 running back. Here's the bear case. Jaylen Warren will press him for touches, especially on third down. He's not replicating anything close to his rookie level touches or receptions. He's never shown game-breaking talent, and his yak is weak for a first-round talent at 230 to 240 pounds. So I was not on Najee Harris last year. Not because I think that he's a bad running back or anything, but I was worried about what could happen to both the Steelers' offense without Roethlisberger and also Harris's target share. Because Harris was seeing a ton of looks during his rookie year behind the line of scrimmage. So without Ben Roethlisberger, maybe those would disappear. And that was on top of the Steelers likely being more run-heavy. A lot more run-heavy. Now, the Steelers' target share of running back actually didn't change that much year over year. But Najee Harris's share dropped by almost 5 percentage points. That was largely because of Jaylen Warren. And then on top of that happening, Pittsburgh ended up seeing about 100 fewer pass attempts. So the logic with Najee Harris was right at a high level. The team became more run-heavy. And the team wasn't as good offensively. But it was wrong at the individual level. Harris could have seen the same target share year over year. Because I was not out there predicting that Jaylen Warren was going to see a 6% target share. Now, I think it seems reasonable that we'd see a similar split in target share between those two backs this year. And that could be somewhat of a problem for Harris. During his rookie season, he had a 14.4% target share. I'd be pretty surprised if he hit a 14% target share this year. I think he's far more likely to be closer to like 10%. The good news is that Harris is playing in an offense that should be better. The Steelers went from being the worst offense in football last year during the front half of the season to a pretty decent one during the second half. I mentioned that on the show about a week or two ago. And when teams are better offensively, it lifts everyone in that offense. And we saw that help Najee Harris last year. Maybe it was his health. He started the season banged up. But during the second half of the year, so after the team's bye, Harris averaged 15.2 PPR points per game. He was at 10.9 during the first half. It wasn't like his backfield share got better during the second half of the season. His rush share actually dropped. His target share remained pretty steady. The Steelers were just better as a team. And that's what we're hoping for in 2023. So I actually think the case with Harris is fairly straightforward. He should be more efficient at scoring fantasy points. Jaylen Warren should still be involved. I mean, Warren was arguably better per touch than Najee Harris last year. So given that, Harris probably needs a Warren injury to really hit a top 5 ceiling in fantasy football. My projections have Najee Harris at RB16 right now. So I've got him very slightly below his best ball ADP. To me, he's just a really solid RB2 with a good floor and an average ceiling. Not really the guy I typically go for, but I understand if people like that safety. But honestly, he's not that much different than he was last year entering the season. The difference is we know that his receiving ceiling is probably a little bit capped. The next question is from EBJ on Patreon. It says, question on opportunity cost. Is there a point in the draft where opportunity cost becomes negligible? Can we basically ignore ADP after a certain round and just go after upside players? So opportunity cost will always be there to some degree. When you make a decision, all the other things that you didn't choose, that's your opportunity cost. So no matter where you are in the draft, there's some cost. Now, as you're asking though, where does opportunity cost matter less? Obviously in the first round, your opportunity cost is very high, as is the case in the second round. What you're really asking here though is something that I talk about in the draft guide. I talked about it last year, and I'm going to talk about it again this year. I take every player to every position since 2011 and I plot their performance. On the x-axis, you've got average draft position. On the y-axis, you have points per game in PPR. So a quarterback who was taken 50th overall one year may have scored 16 points per game. That's one data point. One drafted 60th overall one year might have scored 17 points per game. That's another data point. You do that over and over again until you get some trend lines for each position. And what those trend lines show us is expectation. The number of points we'd expect a player to score at a certain ADP. Now, when looking at those trend lines, the steeper the curve, the larger the opportunity cost. And where things start to flatten is where opportunity cost starts to drop, because the difference from one pick to another is not as significant. You could make the argument that the drop occurs sooner than you think, like around pick 50 or so at running back and wide receiver. So maybe you can get a little bit more wild in like the 5th or the 6th round range and stray away from ADP. But that's also something I want to bring up. When we say things like ignore ADP, that's different than drafting differently than ADP. Chances are you're still going to take a player who belongs relatively close to that draft pick. Like if you're in round 5 and you take a player who's typically a 7th round pick because you're ignoring ADP, I don't think that's the biggest deal in the world at all. If you're in round 5 and you're taking a player who's typically a 14th round pick because you're ignoring ADP, I would not only question why, because you can get them later, but I would question your evaluation skills. ADP is not the worst indicator of success. So you should ask yourself why you're making the decision that you're making before you actually do it. But yeah, overall, there are plenty of spots in the draft where opportunity cost matters less and less. It's always present though. The last question this week is from Twitter, and it's from @WesleyA.Johnson. It says, JJ, longtime fan of your show. Thanks. Where do you/your model rank Isaiah Hodgins? His ADP has him at the bottom of drafts, and he screams value buy. He had an Akers-esque finish to 2022, and he doesn't face a ton of roster competition. He's trending to be my most rostered player. So a few people seem to want this one answered, so let's just dig in. Looking back at Hodgins' prospect profile, it was actually quite good. He came out in 2020, and his prospect score is in the 65th percentile. He had a plus 18% draft capital delta, which is one of the better marks that you're going to find in the model, meaning the NFL seemed to undervalue him. The reason his prospect score was a lot better than his draft score, or where he was drafted, was because he was an early declare wide receiver with pretty good marks in college. He had pretty good production. His breakout age was around 20 years old, nothing wrong with that. His best season yards per team pass attempt was 2.79. That's above average. Now, he wasn't an SEC wide receiver or anything, but everything pointed to him being an undervalued player, at the very least. And that's not just some hindsight take, even though I know people can take it that way. To be honest with you, that should give you more confidence in him being the real deal. Now, he wasn't able to play his rookie year with Buffalo, and then he mostly played the practice squad during his second season in the league. It wasn't until last year with New York where he started to see some work. The problem is that he wasn't necessarily anything special within that New York offense last year. He actually gained targets at a worse rate per route than Darius Slayton, Wan'Dale Robinson, Richie James, and Sterling Shepard. And he wasn't as good in yards per route run than all of those guys too. But here's the good news. The Giants have a whole bunch of slot receivers. And Hodgins played just 13% of his snaps from that area of the field last year. So there's an opportunity for him to find the field immediately as the team's X receiver. I think that Jalen Hyatt is a bigger deal to Darius Slayton than he is Isaiah Hodgins. And I think that combined with his prospect profile is what's most important. He got off to a slow start to his career with his health, and later round picks aren't going to get a ton of opportunity right away anyway. So his slow rise is not that concerning to me. Now, do I think that he's going to ball out in fantasy football? Probably not. Matt Harmon's reception perception sees him as a solid player, but not this game wrecker. And I don't know that I'd say that he was as good as Cam Akers was down the stretch last year. He had one wide receiver, one performance all year long. He had a few solid games, but again, I'm not sure he's going to be someone who you're relying on each week. Now, in a best ball format, in that type of setting, sure. But I would say that Hodgins is unlikely to be a wide receiver 2 or better this year. And that's only reinforced by the fact that he's playing alongside, you guessed it, a mobile quarterback. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening this week, everyone. Greatly appreciate it. I'll talk to you next week.